the BBC was still largely insisting on shooting stuff in the studio on tape. Granada had just the previous year transmitted Jewel in the Crown, a wonderfully lavish production, all on film, which perhaps gave the BBC a bit of a kick up the arse, should we say? So, can you just set up how it came about?
Yeah, you've just done it. No, Granada made those big productions of Brideshead and Jewel in the Crown, which we saw as rather threatening the BBC's reputation for this kind of classic programming that Betty and I and many others have worked on for so many years. But also there was at the same time in those programs a move to take the programs out of the studio and onto film, and we were responding with a number of programs that sort of increased the production values, made things have a kind of greater presence on the screen, and this was one of the leading ones. I mean, we couldn't have made Tender as the Night without having the ability to go and shoot it on film. Certainly couldn't have made it without film, in other words, be able to go and shoot it entirely abroad. I think this may be certainly one of the very few classic serial adaptations that were shot entirely, or almost entirely, 100% on the continent, virtually, where the locations are set. And Christabel, yeah. And of course, the other thing that this was it was a very rare example, and I can't think of any others apart from perhaps if you call Henry James American, his novels, of an entirely American novel that was done as part of our classic serial output. And so all those things came together, plus it was, again, a kind of barrier-breaking co-production, because it was made with Showtime, who were the sort of, it's around the time that HBO and Showtime were those channels were beginning to have an effect, and with 20th Century Fox, who were the owners of the rights to Tender as the Night. So all this had to be put together, and, there were deals to be done and tensions to be got through, but nevertheless, looking back, without that American end, we certainly couldn't have made it in this sort of lavish and I think rather beautiful fashion.
So I think there's only the 1962 film adaptation with Jason Roberts and Jennifer Jones. Apart from this, it can't be an easy novel to adapt, I wouldn't have thought, with its very sort of internal psychological concerns. Betty, what do you think attracted Potter to want to adapt this for television in particular?
Well, I think he probably always liked a challenge apart from anything else, because it's not it's by no means an easy one to do. But he was, it's so rich, isn't it? And he was such a good writer. He recognised something he wanted to do, I think, and he didn't hesitate. He didn't have to convince him at all.
He was very keen, obviously.
Very keen, yes.
And just for all of you, what is it that Potter brings to this adaptation, do you think, that no other writer apart from him could?
Well, we could obviously have found there were other good writers about, but Dennis was pretty outstanding, wasn't he, in his class, really, with such a track record with all the stuff he'd done with Ken. I mean, he was the leading one, he was the one to go for.
Also, it's sort of, I mean, I remember when we were thinking about it, Potter was the first person we came up with, and he accepted, as Betty said, very quickly. But it's not rocket science. I mean, when you read the book, it does have Potter written all over it, to be honest with you. It's got that glamorous world and the tragedy of the central character underneath
and the sadness as well as the sort of wonderful story, really.
Yeah. The inexorability of his decline.
Yes.
The whole examination, of course, of Nicole's mental illness. I mean, Ken, I'm sure, can expand on the themes of Potter, but these are definitely things which had the thumbprint of Potter there.
Yes, and he went for them, didn't he? 100%. Didn't shirk anything, really.
Well, Ken, obviously there's that major theme running through Potter of mental illness and psychological distress. It's there in Singing Detective. It's there in Angels Are So Few and all the rest of it. Do you think there was something about that area that drew him to it?
Well, oddly enough, I mean, I've never quite identified those qualities as being a preoccupation with mental health.
No, no.
No, but
I mean, you know, you can say that anyone who has a writer's block has a mental health problem. Anyone who's stranded in a bed, like the character in The Singing Detective, has a mental health problem. But I think the particular take on those things which Dennis had was very, very personal, persistent, and eccentric. And I actually didn't find that much, which was, you know, Potter trying to put himself through this like a stick of Brighton rock. And there weren't very many lines I felt were Dennis. I thought it was superb, because Dennis, I think, as a creator and if you like, in the best sense, a journeyman, turning himself to a task he was offered, was terrific. I mean, I would say that there was only one characteristic line which I would ask you guys whether it came from Dennis or it was in Scott Fitzgerald, because it related to a line in Dennis where I was involved for a long, long time, and the family still believe I perpetrated quite wrongly dissemination of this aspect, and that was the scene with the first scene with Rosemary, the scene after in the morning, or was it before where she says, "I've slept with 640 men."
That's in the book.
That's in the book.
That's
That's
absolutely
fantastic.
in the book.
That's a wonderful coincidence, because just to tell the audience, Dennis made a confession to me, a personal confession, before he was even in the business of television or entertainment, before I was, that he had slept with a large number of prostitutes. And that motif and that theme was used and alluded to throughout his work. And there's one particular play, Moonlight on the Highway, where you know, it's not the point of the whole thing, but it's the climax. And it's an extraordinary coincidence that there is Scott Fitzgerald inverting the genders and with a character who proclaims similar sexual excess.
So yes, sorry. Go on,
Can I just say that this is the first time I've seen this film for 30 years. So it's quite a shock and also a great discovery. And thank you very much for coming and staying, and also staying to listen to us. But after all, it's a long day's journey into night. Reading the book, as I have this last week, and Jonathan has this last week, I'm staggered at how many lines of dialogue I recognize from the book. Fitzgerald really had a wonderful sense of writing dialogue. I worked just before this show, just briefly if I can go sideways, on a John Fowles, The Ebony Tower. And John Fowles said to me, "Rob, I don't want to hear a single line from my novella in the film script. I've learnt there are three sorts of dialogue. There's dialogue written for the stage, there's dialogue written for a novel to be read, and there's dialogue for film. And I can't write film dialogue." So John Fowles gave me the freedom to go away from this. And when I'm reading this novel again, what staggered me was that it starts for the first 60 pages with a very, very rich, almost too rich language, a literature. Then suddenly it's as sleek as a greyhound. And these extraordinary lines, which Dennis found and adapted, funnily enough, the one line which I was expecting to come in isn't there, is when Dick Diver says, "But who will nourish me?" And I thought, where's that? That's strange. He avoided that one. But otherwise, no, I think actually that, I sometimes think that I let the actors be too little on the nose and the lines. I think Rosemary might have had a bit more fun giving this preposterous number. And just to see what jealousy she could promote. Yes. But in fact, it was too straightly played, and that's it. But interestingly, had we then been able to bring the artist back and to post-sync, which we weren't able to at that time, I think we could have got some different inflections, particularly in the last episode. And that's the one thing. I also lament the fact that obviously at that time we shot the correct, 4:3 framing, which was what our televisions were like. And remember when our televisions were like that? We all have this wonderful film, 1:185, whatever it is. It's nice and wide. And but I also just want to say we shot with a very small crew, very small crew. The lighting cameraman was also laying the tracks for the movements and so on. He really, and so many people just worked there. We shot for 6 months. It was very hard. We were very, very exhausted. And it's a tough story to tell because it's the decline of a marriage and the decline of a particular person.
I think that
I
you know,
thought there
the
was a lot
wider
of-
commonality between Dennis and Fitzgerald in their preoccupations is the plight of the writer. In Fitzgerald's case, the tragic plight of the writer. He was agony, really, about all his stuff, all his life and all his career. Dennis, apart from tragically dying young, had a tremendously successful and ongoing and developing career. I mean, he never looked back. But certainly, from moment to moment and stage to stage, he was agonized, and he used the agony in a much more, if you like, adroit and creative and perhaps even convenient way than Fitzgerald ever did. In fact, there are two versions of this novel which don't hold together, and Dennis chose the more narrative one, didn't he? And Fitzgerald, apart from, I think, Gatsby, Fitzgerald never felt he got anything right.
I think Fitzgerald never felt he'd really finished the novel, to be
That's
honest
correct.
with you. I mean, he did write on the second version, whatever, this is the final version as I would like it, or I don't think there's a great description of him taking somebody into his study and looking at a pile of paper and saying, that's the 400,000 words I've written that he shaped down. But I think, I was watching and I thought, I mean, there's the obvious issue of the two versions, which is where the flashback to the sanatorium is placed. In the generally available one, it comes halfway through the novel. In the revised version of the 50s, it's put at the beginning of the novel, which is the one that Dennis chose to go with, which tells the story in chronological order. But I was struck also watching it by actually the amount of shaping that had gone on in the second half of the novel. I mean, it's quite focused down, and I think those last three episodes are each given quite a distinctive, I mean, the tone changes radically at the beginning of
But did
episode
Dennis
3.
reshape?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
I mean, it's all the material that's in the book, but it's a more sprawling. The first half of the novel seems to me to be quite tight, actually, whatever order you put it in. The second one is quite sprawling, and people come back and so on and so forth. And he's really honed down the instance and honed them down to the kind of, you know, the gathering darkness in episode 4, the focus on Dick's decline in episode 5, the focus on Nicole in episode 6, I think. And they're much simpler, aren't they? I mean, there aren't so many set pieces. They're much more focused on the characters.
It's absolutely right.
Yeah.
What I find looking at it now is I don't think it would be done in this way at all if somebody were to have another go at it, because Dennis likes two-hander scenes.
Oh, yeah.
And that is something which people are a little bit nervous of nowadays in dramatizations. And watching it, I was wondering, I hope you're staying with this, because it's, you know, by the end, it's the same.
Well, I mean,
Three
he liked long two-handed scenes.
Very
Yes.
much.
Yes.
And there are some there.
Yes.
And among the remarks I was looking at that Dennis made about Tender as the Night was that he looks back with nostalgia, because now, when he was talking just a year before his death, he said, if I myself writing, particularly if any Americans involved, more than half a page, I'm worried, and I feel I'm getting too much pleasure out of it and have to move on. So things have changed. And it's also true, although it's not really the subject for this evening, that Dennis, unlike me, and I suppose unlike Jonathan, was not a wild enthusiast for television going to film. Dennis would have preferred it to be more word-based. And when we were setting up The Singing Detective, he had written it hoping it would be a mixture, a rather old-fashioned mixture of videotape and film. I remember having to say to him, well, I suppose we can do that, but we have the money not to. And I can get you a better director if we do it all on film. So the world had changed. And Dennis changed rather reluctantly with it, but of course did catch up because he was so adroit and so utterly kind of adaptable and talented.
But it is telling that he chose to go for the chronological, simple approach and to go with the revised version of the novel, Betty, isn't it? And
Well-
was he adamant about that right from the
Well,
beginning?
he didn't have to be adamant, because I think Jonathan and I agreed with him all the way along that he thought it was better drama storytelling to do it chronologically, because there's enough richness in it. It didn't need to be played around with. Sorry, I can't think of a better way of putting it. And so we...
And do you think, like all great adapters of other people's work, he had almost an intuitive response to what was required depending on the material that he was adapting, if you see what I mean.
Well, I think he must have done, although he never... I wasn't privy to his confidence about things like that, you know, but I think he did, because I can't think of anything he adapted that he didn't do well. And maybe...
No, I think he sort of marauded into material.
He
you know,
did,
just
and he loved
took it and
he
made it
loved
his own, but
stories.
also satisfied whoever was employing him for that work of adaptation.
Yes.
And sometimes even
Yeah.
adapted himself.
I think so, but I
the
think-
film we did called Dream Child,
I mean-
partly about the Alice in Wonderland story, was based on a play of Dennis's, which he wrote in the first year of his playwriting life, called Alice. So he always looked at material, always felt that he could possess other people's stuff, but somehow remained uncannily true to it.
Yes.
It also struck me watching it that he, you know, in spite of remaining uncannily true to it and sort of being Dennis Potter, as, you know, not somebody who took notes, certainly not from me anyway. I probably did from Ken. But, you know, that first episode where he's taken the sanatorium material, which is about pages 100, 150, and put them at the beginning, which is perfectly reasonable thing to do, given that Fitzgerald himself wanted. But, you know, we do start, and I timed it actually, 10 minutes in, Ed Asner comes in and says, no, it was incest. You know, he's had his eye on, you know, the real kind of mechanics of storytelling. The big scene in the middle of the first episode about Dick, where Dick is, that's right, the older man says to Dick, you mustn't betray your talent, you know, which is the kind of focus of that episode. And so not only are we really quickly drawn into the story, but we're really quickly given, in a very kind of prominent way, that central theme of what the tragedy of this man is about.
But
So I think, underneath all this, of course, it seems to me that Dennis has, you know, really paid proper attention to storytelling skills and was very respectful of his audience.
No, I was just going to say, isn't it true, but it may be part of one of Dennis's exaggerations, that Showtime wanted to do it in 5 episodes, and Dennis said, I can only do it in 6, and he went to them and persuaded them. So
I
he
think
wanted to
sent
operate
me
in
to them,
relation.
actually.
He said us.
He sent
I mean,
me to them, actually.
Well, I don't know.
There was
Yes. He did
there
want
was
to.
some. Actually, you know, they were Showtime. It was a whole new thing, this of doing. You know, we had to talk to Americans, and that was quite foreign to us, because we were BBC employees, you know, and those days it's different now, I'm sure, but I don't work there, thank goodness. But anyway, but in those days we'd well, frankly, we didn't pay any attention to anything anybody else said to us. And suddenly we were posed with these rather. I mean, the executive producer at Showtime was a very nice, very considerable man called Peter Chernin, who now runs Rupert Murdoch's empire. So, you know, we weren't dealing with klutzes here. My memory is that there was a little bit of a skirmish about the length. Whether
there
he
was.
went to them or Betty, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. There was a bit of a skirmish about 5 or 6 episodes, and Dennis was adamant, no, look, you know, I'm Dennis Potter, you hire me, I do it the way I want it, 6 episodes, shut up or go away.
And Dennis had a comparable insularity, not quite the same insularity as being a BBC employee. He only had a passport first at the age of 42 and went to New York for a tourist holiday. And also, I mean, when I think about it, it is surprising if he did a persuasive job on some Americans, because he wasn't very, very good at talking successfully to Americans. I can remember a number of occasions, particularly in that sort of Reagan period, where we would go for lunch with enthusiastic Americans who'd come over to see us and think it had all gone very well, but somehow never hear from them again, because towards the end of the lunch, Dennis had taken them to the cleaners for Vietnam or something. So we didn't get the gigs.
I think that he was adamant, but also, you know, looking at it, I mean,
right.
you know, it is a program that takes its time, but nevertheless, you know, that 6-episode structure, I think, is very important to it, you know, because the first half of the book, which ends up with the marriage of the two of them after the, is an absolute fulcrum, and then we come to later, and then that second half has a very, very kind of different tone. I think it just needed that sort of balance.
And as we've got Tarek in the audience, I wanted to ask Robert, actually, that Potter's just brilliant at getting that sense of it gradually moving towards, you know, more and more despair and disillusionment over the years. and I just wondered about the pacing of it and how you worked with Tarek to pick that up out of Potter's adaptation and realise it so beautifully in the way you've paced the film.
I got some of it wrong. Watching it now, I realise that I got some of the tempos wrong. I should have let them overlap far more and all the rest of that. And sometimes got certain scenes up. Look, we shot right out of order. All filming is right out of order. So I think we started Switzerland, France, back to Switzerland, back to France, or something like that.
Several of those
Yeah.
scenes in today's,
Yeah.
you did right at the very beginning of the shoot.
We did.
Yes, I remember
And
that, yes.
so one gets the pace wrong as a director, particularly if you're working over 6 hours and it was shot completely out of order. I mean, the great thing about an editor who's a natural storyteller, editors are functional in that they come in two I'm sure Tarek will tell me they come in far more classes than that. But there are natural storytellers, and there are people who are very good at slashing a tape together, or the celluloid, or what have you. If Tarek is listening, if he's still here,
He's over there.
He's there. Is he hiding?
Yeah, I'd be aware of that
something?
word functional if I were you. Rob.
I remember Tarek going for the Ed Asner scene and reducing it to high speed. I having to say, no. There was a totally different way of editing. But the great thing is, if a director stays away from the editing, well, Tarek, were you editing from day one?
Yes.
Great, because that's the way it should be. And the director's away and all the rest of this. I don't want to see it when it's being assembled, because it's coming to him out of order. The whole thing is coming out. And we start to then see it, preferably, in episode lengths. And you sit there and you think, does this work? Does this work? This is good. And sometimes I've sat with my hand behind an editor saying, how can you possibly not know the script well enough to cut it that way? And all the rest of that. An editor is a storyteller too. Everybody on the crew is a storyteller too. And obviously we're working with the script. So, not all the actors were as keen to say Dennis Potter's lines as I was. And so, we had some good old battles saying, no, stay with this, stay with this, stay with this. And when you have people of the standard of John Hurd and Mary, yeah, I'm just pausing because I'm besotted with Mary 30 years later.
Absolutely.
And just that face, that ability to be surprised and to be you are absolutely so fabulous. And John Hurd gives an absolutely fabulous performance.
But there's a very interesting quote about Tender is the Night from Potter, which is, it's a fable imposed on a love story, and since it's so clearly about Fitzgerald and Zelda, the love story is the dread of what's going to happen to him as a human being.
Fair enough.
Anybody want to make a comment on that? I mean, can we see a connection there between the absolute horror of losing your talent and, again, writer's block, given that Fitzgerald hadn't written anything for 9 years up to this point? There's Philip Marlowe with writer's block in The Singing Detective and so on. Is there a connection there between Potter and Fitzgerald again, do we think? Or is that stretching it
No, I
too
mean, I think
far?
the statement you read out of Dennis it's almost like a three-line treatment, isn't it? To say this is the love story, and it's very simple, and he left all the other things out in case the financiers don't have a large attention span. I mean, it seems to be completely.
I suppose what I'm
true.
getting at is,
But
did he have
I
a
don't
horror
see it.
of a wasted life?
I
as
can't
it
think of
were?
other Dennis pieces where a love affair is paralleled or disguised as a writer's block or anything like that. I can't quite see that connection.
I don't think he had a block, and he also had a very happy marriage.
But
Dennis, in comparison to
Yes.
Fitzgerald.
Yes.
You know more
But
than
he
me.
does say
But-
in that introduction,
no, he did have a writer's block from time.
he does say, he wrote an introduction, I think Ken's got it there, I don't know if that's that bit of paper. He does say in that introduction that not so much that Tender is the Night was about the Fitzgerald relationship, but that there were echoes of it, and
Yeah.
he responded to those echoes. He responded to Fitzgerald's kind of not putting himself into the novel, but kind of echoing his own life in the novel. And Dennis, I think, he says it at the beginning of the introduction, found that a very kind of mesmerising thing
Yeah,
about the
that's
book.